Millionaire returns home to pregnant wife in tears. The truth left him speechless. He thought money could solve everything, from the glittering towers of the city to the sprawling estate he called home. Wealth was his armor. A self-made millionaire, admired by colleagues and envied by rivals. He believed he had built a life so secure, nothing could shake it. Every deal signed, every dollar earned was proof that he had conquered the world. Or so he thought. But sometimes the deepest cracks form in the places we least expect. It was supposed to be a night like any other. A late evening flight back from a business trip. The hum of engines still echoing in his ears as his driver pulled into the long driveway. The house stood silent under the soft glow of the garden lights. Beautiful, yet strangely cold. He carried his briefcase with the confidence of a man who thought he was walking back into peace. But the silence he felt inside wasn't the calm of a resting home. It was the silence before a storm. When he opened the door, the first sound wasn't laughter or a warm greeting, or even the faint hum of the television. It was something far more chilling, a muffled sob, then another. He froze, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place of safety, the kind of sound that makes your heart stop because you know, without understanding why, that something is terribly wrong. He followed the sound, his footsteps heavier with each step down the hallway. And then there she was, his wife, 8 months pregnant, sitting on the floor of their bedroom. Her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling with every breath. Around her were tissues scattered like fallen leaves, proof that these weren't the first tears she had shed tonight. His world tilted. This wasn't the picture of comfort he imagined for her. This wasn't the glow of anticipation they had both dreamed about. And in that moment, standing in the doorway, suitcase still in hand, one question echoed louder than all the silence and sobs combined. What could possibly break the heart of a woman who should be living her happiest days? What he was about to uncover would shake his life far more than any business deal ever could. The mansion had never felt so hollow. Every polished surface, every expensive chandelier, every carefully placed piece of art. Suddenly, it all looked meaningless. For years he had worked tirelessly to build this empire, to give his family a life beyond worry. Yet now, standing there in that grand home, he realized no amount of marble floors or gilded frames could shield them from pain. He placed the suitcase gently on the floor and rushed to his wife's side. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes swollen and red. The sight nearly broke him. This wasn't the strong, radiant woman who had stood by him through every hardship. This was someone crushed under a weight she could no longer carry alone. But she didn't speak. Not yet. She turned her face away, as if ashamed, as if afraid that telling him the truth might make it even more real. He sat beside her, his hand hovering, unsure whether to comfort her or wait until she was ready. The silence stretched, broken only by her trembling breaths. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to know who he was before this night. He hadn't been born rich. Far from it. His childhood was spent in the cramped back room of a corner store his father managed, where every dollar was stretched to its breaking point. He grew up watching his parents sacrifice their dreams so he could chase his own. That sacrifice lit a fire in him, a determination to succeed, no matter the cost. By 35, he had built a company from scratch, carving his fortune out of sheer grit and sleepless nights. People called him ruthless, but he thought of himself as relentless. He believed he was doing it all for his family, for his wife, for the child they had long prayed for. The child who was finally on the way. But the truth about men like him is simple. Sometimes, in the pursuit of everything, they lose sight of what matters most. He had missed anniversaries, birthdays, even doctor's appointments for the baby. He told himself it was temporary, that once the business stabilized, he would slow down and be there for every moment. His wife never complained. She smiled, she encouraged, she assured him she understood. Until tonight, now, as he sat beside her, that illusion shattered. The sobs weren't just exhaustion. They weren't just hormones or nerves. They were something heavier. She finally spoke, her voice breaking like fragile glass. "I tried to stay strong," she whispered. I didn't want to burden you, but I can't do this alone anymore." Her words cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal, deeper than any financial loss he had ever endured. He had built his fortune on control, on never letting anything slip through his fingers. Yet here, in the one place he thought was safe, he realized he had already lost control. He looked around the room and noticed details he had overlooked before. Unopened letters on the nightstand, missed calls on her phone, even a hospital bracelet lying half-hidden beneath the bed. A chill crept over him. How long had she been silently carrying this weight? The air in the room seemed heavier now. He wanted to demand answers, to know immediately what had broken her spirit. But something in her trembling body told him this wasn't the moment for demands. This was the moment for patience, for presence, for listening, something he hadn't given her in far too long. As he wrapped an arm around her, she leaned against him. But the tears didn't stop. Instead, they came harder, her whole body shaking as if finally releasing months of held-in pain. In that moment, he realized something terrifying. The world he had built might look strong from the outside, but within these walls, the foundation was cracking, and he had no idea just how deep the fracture went. The night seemed endless. Hours slipped by as the mansion stood cloaked in silence, but his mind refused to rest. He couldn't stop replaying her words. "I can't do this alone anymore." They echoed inside him, louder than any deal he had ever made, sharper than any rival's betrayal. He needed answers, but fear gnawed at him. What if the truth was worse than anything he imagined? The next morning, he rose early. He wasn't dressed in his usual pressed suit or designer shoes. Today, he wore only a plain shirt and trousers, as if subconsciously shedding the armor of wealth that had always shielded him. Quietly, he moved through the house, scanning for clues. That's when he saw it. The unopened letters piled on the nightstand. His heart sank. He picked one up and froze at the seal, the hospital's logo. Hands trembling, he tore it open. Inside was a bill dated weeks ago. Another envelope revealed test results. Another, appointment reminders, unanswered. His chest tightened. Why hadn't she told him? Or had she tried, and he was simply too busy to notice? For a man who prided himself on control, the discovery was crushing. He felt like a stranger in his own home. Every letter screamed of a silent struggle his wife had been fighting while he buried himself in boardrooms and balance sheets. When he returned to the bedroom, she was awake, sitting by the window, staring blankly at the garden outside. She looked fragile, yet unyielding, like glass that had cracked but refused to shatter completely. He sat beside her again, this time determined not to let silence win. "What happened?" he asked softly. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't turn away this time. Slowly, haltingly, she spoke. She told him about the fainting spell weeks ago, the rushed hospital visit, the complications the doctors had warned about. She told him about the stress of going through it alone, pretending everything was fine when inside she was terrified. And she told him about the whispers, the relatives, the neighbors, even so-called friends, who judged her when he wasn't around, saying wealth couldn't buy love, saying she had married a man who cared more for his empire than his family. Every word was a dagger. He had thought money was the solution to every problem, but here was proof that it had blinded him. His wife wasn't craving mansions or cars or vacations. She was craving him, his presence, his hand to hold, his voice to reassure her that they would face everything together. As she spoke, he realized how wide the distance between them had grown. He could recall every contract he'd signed, every investor he'd convinced, every late-night strategy session, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down to truly listen to her. His heart ached as he pictured her walking into hospital rooms alone, carrying their unborn child while battling fear in silence. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. And it was his fault. But before guilt could crush him completely, she said something that made his blood run cold. They said if the stress continues, it could harm the baby. The baby, their miracle. The life they had prayed for through years of waiting, of heartbreak, of near giving up. The thought that his absence, his choices, might endanger that child made his knees weak. From that moment, the story was no longer about him. It wasn't about his success, his empire, or his reputation. It was about saving what truly mattered: his wife, his child, his family. But the challenge wouldn't be as simple as closing a deal. This wasn't a contract to be signed, or a negotiation to be won. This was about rebuilding trust, about showing his wife she was not alone anymore. And deep down, he feared he had waited too long. The day stretched heavy with tension. He stayed by her side, canceling meetings, ignoring phone calls. For the first time in years, the world of business didn't matter. He was trying desperately to prove his presence. Yet even as he held her hand, even as he promised he wouldn't leave again, her eyes carried doubt. Promises were easy to make. She had heard them before. What she needed was action, proof that he meant it this time. That night, as she finally drifted to sleep, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about profits or strategies. He was thinking about how to be a husband, how to be a father. And in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing dread grew stronger. What if he was already too late? The morning sun rose, casting pale light across the grand house, but it did nothing to ease the storm inside him. He had spent the entire night turning over every word she had said, every moment he had failed to notice, every warning sign he had ignored. His empire meant nothing now. He would trade it all if it meant protecting his wife and their unborn child. But fate doesn't wait for second chances. That very day, as he prepared breakfast clumsily, burning toast and spilling coffee, but determined to try, the silence from upstairs shattered into a sound that froze his blood. A cry. His wife's cry. He dropped everything and raced up the stairs, his chest pounding harder than any boardroom confrontation had ever made it. She was on the floor beside the bed, clutching her stomach, her face pale with pain. The sight was like a knife twisting inside him. "Hold on," he whispered, scooping her into his arms. "I'm here, I won't let anything happen." The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights, honking horns, and desperate prayers. For the first time in his life, he broke rules, ignoring traffic signals, swerving past cars, honking without care. Money, power, reputation, none of it mattered. Only her, only them. Inside the hospital, chaos engulfed him. Nurses rushed forward, doctors called out orders, monitors beeped with urgency. He tried to follow, but he was pushed aside as they wheeled her away. For a man used to controlling every room he entered, standing powerless in the sterile white hallway was torture. He paced back and forth, his fists clenched, his heart in his throat. Minutes stretched into hours. The empire builder who had once commanded hundreds of employees now found himself begging silently, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Finally, a doctor emerged. The man's face was calm but serious. "She's stable," he said. Relief washed over him like a flood, but before he could exhale, the doctor added, "But the pregnancy is under severe stress. We need to monitor her closely. The next 24 hours will be critical." Those words landed like a hammer. The next 24 hours. Time, something he had always treated as abundant, was suddenly fragile, slipping through his fingers. He was allowed into her room where she lay pale, exhausted, but awake. She looked at him, not with anger, not with blame, but with something far worse. A deep weariness, as if she wasn't sure she could keep fighting. He knelt by her bed, his hand trembling as it wrapped around hers. "I should have been here," he whispered, voice breaking. "I should have listened, I should have seen you. I thought I was building a future for us, but what good is a future if you're not in it? If our child isn't in it?" Tears slipped down his face, raw and unguarded. The kind of tears he hadn't shed since he was a boy. His empire, his pride, his invincible image, all crumbled in that hospital room. For hours he stayed by her side. He fed her spoonfuls of water, adjusted her pillows, refused to take a single call no matter how urgent. His phone buzzed endlessly. Deals, investors, headlines. But he silenced it all. The only heartbeat that mattered was hers. Night fell. Machines hummed softly. She stirred, her fingers tightening weakly around his. And in that fragile grasp he felt it, the flicker of hope. But just as relief began to settle, alarms suddenly blared. Nurses rushed in, their voices urgent. The monitors spiked. His heart stopped. "Sir, please step outside," one of the nurses ordered, but he refused. He stood frozen, watching as doctors swarmed her, barking instructions, moving quickly to stabilize her condition. It was the longest moment of his life. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. The thought that he could lose her, the only woman he had ever truly loved, and their unborn child in one instant, was unbearable. And then, silence. The machine steadied, her breathing calmed. The doctors relaxed slightly, their voices lowering. One of them looked at him and nodded. "She's stable again. For now." His legs gave out, and he collapsed into the chair beside her bed, burying his face in his hands. Relief crashed over him, mixed with exhaustion, guilt, and gratitude so intense it hurt. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a millionaire, a businessman, or a tycoon. He was simply a man, a husband, a father-to-be, begging for one more chance to make things right. And in that moment he made a silent vow. If they survived this, he would never again let wealth blind him to what truly mattered. The night in the hospital stretched on endlessly, a blur of flickering monitors, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the steady hum of machines. He sat there, his hand wrapped around hers, refusing to let go even for a second. For the first time in his life, sleep didn't matter, work didn't matter, and the millions in his bank account were meaningless. What mattered was the fragile rise and fall of her chest, the warmth of her hand, and the promise of the life growing inside her. Hours earlier, he had thought his world was collapsing. But as he sat there, broken down and stripped of his pride, something unexpected began to happen. Clarity. He thought back to the night he first met her, how she had laughed at his awkward joke, how her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, how she never cared about his wealth, only his heart. She had always seen him, the man beneath the money. And in return, what had he given her? Grand houses, luxury cars, a life of comfort, yes, but comfort wrapped in loneliness because he had been absent. And now, staring at her in that hospital bed, he realized that none of it mattered. Not the boardrooms, not the deals, not the headlines. If he lost her, if he lost their child, everything else would turn to dust. By morning, she was stable again. The doctor smiled cautiously, telling him the crisis had passed, but that the months ahead would require care, rest, and constant attention. "She can't go through this alone," one doctor said pointedly, and those words pierced him deeper than any accusation ever could. He nodded silently. "She won't," he promised. When she finally woke fully, her eyes heavy but clear, she found him still there, unshaven, rumpled, his suit wrinkled from a night spent in the hospital chair. He looked nothing like the polished millionaire who usually walked through glass towers with confidence. But she didn't need that man. She needed this one, the one who held her hand, who stayed, who wept for her. He leaned in, his voice breaking. "I almost lost you. I almost lost both of you. I can't go back to who I was. I won't. From now on, you're my world. You and our child. Nothing else." Tears glistened in her eyes, and for the first time in months she believed him. Not because of the words, but because she saw it in his eyes. Raw, desperate, unfiltered truth. In the days that followed, he made changes. Small at first, but powerful. He turned down calls from investors. He postponed meetings. When the hospital released her, he personally carried her into their home, ignoring the waiting staff, determined to care for her himself. He cooked clumsy meals, burned toast, spilled soup, but each mistake made her laugh softly, reminding her that love wasn't in perfection. It was in presence. He began attending every doctor's appointment, listening closely, asking questions, learning what she needed. The man who once measured life in profits and losses now measured it in heartbeats and quiet moments. And then came the biggest step. He called an emergency board meeting. Executives shuffled in nervously, expecting another ruthless strategy, another demand for growth. Instead, he shocked them all. "I'm stepping back," he announced. "Effective immediately. My family needs me. The company will survive without me. But my wife and child, without me, They won't. There was stunned silence. Some whispered, some gasped, others stared as though they couldn't believe the words coming from his mouth. But he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't seeking their approval. He was seeking redemption. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, the cracks in his marriage began to heal. He sat with her every evening, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the baby's future. He read books on fatherhood, something he never thought he'd do. He even redecorated a room into a nursery himself, clumsily painting walls and assembling furniture, laughing with her when screws didn't fit and colors clashed. And then finally the day came. She went into labor. It was long, exhausting, painful. He was at her side through it all, whispering encouragement, holding her hand until his fingers went numb, praying harder than he ever had in his life. And when at last the cry of a newborn filled the room, he broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as the doctor placed the tiny, fragile life in his arms. A baby girl, his daughter. He looked at her, so small, so perfect, and then at his wife who lay exhausted but smiling. And in that moment, everything changed forever. He wasn't just a millionaire anymore. He wasn't just a husband, he was a father. And this time he swore he wouldn't fail. Months later, those who knew him whispered about the transformation. The ruthless tycoon who had once lived only for business was gone. In his place stood a man who carried his daughter to the park, who held his wife's hand at family dinners, who turned down multi-million-dollar deals just to stay home and read bedtime stories. The world saw weakness in that. They called him soft. They said he'd lost his edge. But he didn't care, because he knew the truth. He hadn't lost anything. He had gained everything. One night, long after the baby was asleep, he stood on the balcony with his wife beside him, the city lights glittering below. He wrapped his arm around her, resting his forehead against hers. "I used to think success was about building an empire," he whispered. "But I see now, the greatest empire I'll ever build is right here. With you, with her, with us." And as she leaned into him, tears shining in her eyes, he felt it. The weight of redemption, the gift of a second chance, the kind of wealth no amount of money could ever buy. Because in the end, when the world strips you down to your core, all that's left is love. And love was finally enough.